Welcome to the Spotlight. I'm Tamanna Inamdar. The one big story dominating global headlines this week has been the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. Many people can't believe that 2 years after a pandemic has gripped the world, humankind would choose now to go to war. Some are calling it the largest military action in Europe after World War II. It is a situation which is extremely uncertain. We don't know what will happen next. This week on the Spotlight, we don't plan to tell you what's going to happen because frankly, nobody knows. We want to explain to you why this could have happened and what India's position is in this entire situation. But first, just some visual perspective because we speak about Ukraine in very distant terms. Ukraine is not a small, piddly country attached to Russia. It's a fairly large space. Of course, Russia is much bigger. And Russia has been trying to eat into parts of Ukraine for some time now. So in 2014, they annexed Crimea, which if you can see on the map is towards the south. And that then came out of the outline of Ukraine, to put it very simply. At that time, you still had a lot of Russian presence in what is the Donbas region. And recently, on the 22nd of this month, in fact, Putin declared 2 areas in that region as independent entities out of Ukraine once again. Once these areas were declared as independent, then it gave him enough reason in his eyes to go ahead and invade, ostensibly to protect the people of these areas. So now what you have is a grab for space. But the story goes much deeper than this because the very valid question would be is why does Putin or why does Russia, why does the government there want to grab more land? What is the problem they have with Ukraine? Is it as simple as the fact that Ukraine used to be part of the USSR and isn't anymore? What really is the genesis of the issue? Now, on the Spotlight, we're going to discuss this issue from every angle and give you more perspective than news on what's going on. So let's begin by telling you how the story started. Russia has been increasing its build-up of troops on its border with Ukraine since late last year. By the 18th of February, the US estimated that there were close to 200,000 troops on this border. Vladimir Putin, the Russian president, insisted that the troop build-up was part of military exercises and there was no intent of invading Ukraine. Satellite images showed otherwise. Apart from the build-up of troops, NATO and US President Joe Biden was skeptical of Putin's claims because of the events of 2014. In March 2014, the then leader of Ukraine, believed to be pro-Russian Viktor Yanukovych, was deposed by rebel groups. Simultaneously, Russia annexed and took over a part of Ukraine, Crimea. While a pro-European leader, Volodymyr Zelensky, took charge in Kiev, Putin's long-standing grouse has been Ukraine, an erstwhile member of the Soviet Union, cozying up to Europe and claiming that they will soon join NATO. Putin sees this as a threat, with NATO inching too close to Russia for his comfort. The history is complicated because some parts of Ukraine, namely the Donbas region, are culturally aligned with Russia, while a big part of its population wants to see itself as part of NATO and aligned with Europe. On the 22nd of February, Russia declared the regions of Donetsk and Luhansk that lie within Ukraine's borders as independent nations. Moscow's argument is that Ukraine is waging genocide against the people of this region and he is liberating them.
This is the beginning of a Russian invasion of Ukraine.
The West sees this as an invasion of territory. Even so, immediate action by the US and its allies was restricted to sanctions against these two regions, some Russian financial institutions and individuals. But that was just the start. Russia has now launched what it calls a military operation on Ukraine. Russia's claim is that the military action is in response to requests from the regions of Donetsk and Luhansk. The West sees this as an outright attack on a sovereign nation. So, as the story continues to unfold, we need to understand some things very clearly. What is the United States' interest in this? I mean, it's pretty clear that Europe does not want an advancement of Russia's sphere of influence by taking control of Ukraine. Vladimir Putin doesn't want his space to be sort of encroached by, European nations and NATO going further. But why is America so invested in this conflict? Is it as simple as their participation in NATO? What is the Indian perspective and why it's such a tough tightrope walk for us? Because we have very strong cultural, traditional ties with Russia. We have a very strong bond right now, ever growing with the United States. And there is a time now when we may have to pick a side. How do we do that? To speak on all of these issues, I have with me a very special guest. I'm joined by P.S. Raghavan, who's former ambassador to Russia. Thank you so much for speaking with us, Ambassador Raghavan. Great to have you on the show today. Let me start at the beginning. What really would you describe the nature of the relationship between Russia and India? Yesterday, Prime Minister Modi had a conversation with Vladimir Putin. You've had a statement today from the Russians saying that at the next vote at the UN Security Council, they expect India to vote in their favor. What really is the kind of relationship that allows Russia to ask that of India or keeps India from openly condemning Russia's aggression in Ukraine?
Thank you very much for having me today. Let me say the India-Russia relationship is a very old one. It's something that harks back to the Soviet days and during the Cold War time, when there were these blocs and where obviously India found itself willy-nilly with the Soviet Union for the simple reason that the Soviet Union supported us at very critical times in our history, in terms of their political support on matters like Kashmir, on matters like even Goa and things like that in the past. In fact, they have wielded the Security Council 5 times in favor of India at critical times in our history. And then, of course, there is this defense cooperation, which also dates back decades. At the moment, 60 to 70% of our armed forces equipment, and particularly the larger weapon systems, the more important weapon systems, are Soviet or Russian in origin and continue to be upgraded by the Russians. So you have a very important defense cooperation. Also, one has to look at geography to understand geopolitics. Russia is this large country, the space which is on above us, so to speak. But in that Eurasian space between India and Afghanistan, Central Asia and China, if you look at it. So that is an area of very great security and strategic interest for India. And if you look at Russia and China dominating that space, India has to be in that space. We need good relations with Russia to occupy that space and also to see to what extent we can ensure that the close Russia-China relations do not impact on India's security. In other words, we have to make sure that Russia has sufficient interest in relations with India not to let Russia-China relations make it act in ways inimical to India's interests. I mean, there's a long and complicated response, but it is something that is difficult to describe in a shorter way.
I understand, Ambassador Raghavan, but simply put, the question is this. At some point, India will have to take a stance. We will have to, we want to have the balancing act, and it's in our national interest to see which way we want to play this. But at some point, you're going to have to admit that what is wrong is wrong. You can't ingress into another sovereign nation's territory, because if you say it's okay for Russia to do that, then where does it end?
But that question has to be considered in the light of history. Now, this is not the first time, and it is not going to be the last time, that a great power has violated international law in pursuit of what it considers its core national security interests. I mean, okay, it considers it in its core national security interests. You may or may not agree. But throw your mind back to 2003, for example, when America invaded Iraq. on the grounds that there were weapons of mass destruction there which were never found. And I remember at that time, I was in the Prime Minister's office in India at that time, the tremendous pressure that came to us from America at that time, not to issue statements criticizing the invasion. And you might recall at that time there was a great deal of drama because our parliament passed a resolution at that time, and there was this great balancing act, if you like, about how they would describe their criticism. So eventually it was decided to issue the statement in Hindi so that they would say, iska ninda karte hain, because they said ninda is a less strong word than condemning. So I'm just telling you this, that it is not every country, every large country, when it feels it is in its crucial national interest to do something, does it, and then explains it ex post facto in moral grounds. So let us look at, I would like to go back to how you started this program, talking about the larger geopolitics of it.
Yes.
Because essentially, this is actually a move in the larger geopolitical chessboard, what is going on in Ukraine. It is a tragedy that Ukrainian people have become the victims of this large game which is being played between, basically it is being played between Russia and the US. And you asked this question quite correctly, why is the US so concerned about Ukraine and with Europe? This is a holdover from the Cold War days.
If you were to help make this decision today of what should India's statement look like, and remember, this is the day of social media and Twitter where world leaders are expressing their thought on social media. What should we be saying where we are looking after our interests? We're not burning the bridges with Russia. We're not burning the bridges with the United States. And we're making sure that we have someone covering our back in the conflict which is ongoing with China.
Right. This is not new to us to start with. After all, the US-Russia confrontation has been going on since the time that Russia annexed Crimea. And since then, we are in fact, subject to sanctions for defense cooperation with Russia under CATSA, which is the American legislation. Now, you see, just because other world leaders are saying something, that should not pressurize India to say something. We have to be very clear about that. We have to mind our interests. Now, balance is not a wrong thing, When you say that you have interest with one country and interest with another country, and you protect your interests with both countries, that is not a bad thing. And by the way, you talked about who will protect us against China. Actually, just like Ukraine, nobody is going to protect us against China if you have a war with China. You need all kinds of support in different ways. And there, you see, the US relationship is very important for us in the maritime domain in the Indo-Pacific. That is our partnership with the US. Besides, of course, in various other ways, the US partnership is extraordinarily important to us. US is our most important bilateral relationship today. All that is accepted. But the US itself wants India to be militarily strong. If you go back to the year 2000, when we built our strategic partnership with the US, one of the first things that the US said was we would like a militarily strong India in South Asia. How do you get a militarily strong India in South Asia? If you do not permit defense cooperation with Russia, because all your major equipment is Russian. If you stop dealing with Russia, your armed forces do not have equipment to fight any war. So the US also recognizes that. Therefore, it is not a question of choosing one side over the other. International relations, especially today's international relations, where you don't have the Cold War, you have various relationships reinforcing each other. And as long as you have, US does not gain anything by your condemning the Russian invasion.
Yeah.
So how does it help anybody? It helps much more if you look after your interests, you look after your maritime interests with the help of the US, you look after your continental interests and your defense interests with the help of Russia. Each relationship has its important place. And one needs to take that into account. And, if you look further afield, if you look at the way countries are behaving, look at Turkey. Turkey is a NATO country which is hobnobbing with Russia. It is hobnobbing with Russia but supporting Ukraine. It is with Russia in Syria, but fighting with Russia in Libya. This is international order today.
Yep.
The post-Cold War world, you talked about world order in your introduction. There is no world order as yet. Post-Cold War, you just have a series of structures which are jostling for primacy. And that is also the reason why you have this Russia conflict in Ukraine, because even a European security architecture post-Cold War has not developed the way it ought to develop.
So it's a situation which is in flux, but very interesting insights coming in there, which are more nuanced from Ambassador Raghavan. It's not as simple as are you with us or are you against us. It is much more to that, and India, like every other nation, needs to look at our interest first. It is literally each country for themselves. Thank you so much for joining us today on Spotlight. Now, crude has hit over $100 a barrel. Oil prices are expected to remain on the boil as supply tensions persist, sanctions come in, etc. And that perhaps is the biggest question mark as far as India is concerned. If you're asking ke humko kya fark padta hai, why does this matter for us? The answer is crude. And my colleague Somit is telling us exactly why.
As higher crude prices is a reason to worry globally, we try to gauge the possibilities that could lead to a decline in crude prices going forward. So the first possibility is the US lifting sanctions on Iran. Now this wouldn't happen immediately, but over some time period of time, if the sanctions are lifted, then Iran could add possibly 1.3 to 1.5 million barrels of crude per day, which could lead to a reduction in crude prices. The second possibility is US itself increasing its production. Now according to experts, the current production is close to 12.2 million barrels of crude, and this could further increase by nearly 1.8 million barrels of crude per day. And this is because US has that much capacity to increase the production. The third possibility is that if OPEC itself increases its production or even is able to meet its production target. Now in the month of January 2022, the OPEC missed its production target by nearly 1 million barrels of crude. Now if even they meet this production target or increase their production target, Brent crude prices could decrease going forward. Now even for India, crude at $100 per barrel is a matter of concern, and that is because nearly 85% of India's crude requirement is imported in the country. Now how does it impact India? Firstly, it increases the inflationary pressure. And if you see, according to Nomura, nearly 10% increase in crude prices increases India's headline inflation by nearly 30 basis points. Along with this, as crude is one of the major raw material and it is used in many industries, the input cost and the cost of production for these industries increases. For namely paint, tire, cement, lubricant manufacturers, for them crude is one of the major raw material and their cost of production increases. Along with this, for an airline, fuel cost is one of the major costs, and hence their cost also increases going forward. Now, as India imports nearly 85% of its crude requirement, a $1 per barrel rise in crude prices increases in India's import bill by nearly $2 billion. And lastly, if you see the current account deficit, that also deteriorates with a rise in crude prices. Now, according to RBI estimates, a $10 per barrel rise in crude prices increases India's annual current account deficit by nearly $12.5 billion.
And how long will crude stay firm? Will prices stay on the boil? So some time ago, Feridun Fesharaki, the founder and chairman of FGE, spoke with us at ET Now and talked about crude prices impacting world economy and India's growth story. Listen in.
In a period of cheap money and high growth, probably an energy shock can be tolerated. If you start raising the interest rates and tighten the economy and the economic growth rate slows down, then the energy shock impact would be great. But in the world of cheap money, I think that $100 oil is tolerable. For countries like India, the high oil prices is a very bad development, particularly at this point in time where recovery is now sort of in the process. But India is one part of the world, so there is nothing anybody can do.
So that is the biggest question for India. Where will crude go? But there is also a moral question. Where do we stand as a people if we are seeing innocent civilians suffering? Hopefully, there will be an answer soon to to this crisis which has visited us at a very, very crucial and vulnerable period for the global economy. I hope this has been informative for you. Thank you so much for joining us this week on Spotlight. We'll be back again next week, same time, same place.